The Battle of Coleto Creek was a battle fought on March 19th and 20th, 1836. After the Alamo fell to Santa Anna's forces on March 6, 1836, Colonel James W. Fannin received orders from General Sam Houston to fall back to Victoria. However, Fannin did not act immediately. Instead, he would send Colonel William Ward and the Georgia Battalion to help Amon B. King at the Battle of Refugio. This move proved to be a big mistake. This dangerously divided the Goliad garrison, thus reducing it by about 150 men. But the move became the main reason Fannin wanted so long to abandon Goliad. After gathering additional supplies, Fannin learned of King and Ward's defeat on March 17th, but he still did not order the retreat to Victoria until the next day. Even though Mexican forces were close to Goliad and that Urrea's army had been reinforced by veterans from the Battle of the Alamo, at 9 a.m. on March 19th, during a period of heavy fog, the Texians began their retreat from Goliad. Although he neglected to take enough water and food for more than a few meals, he insisted on taking 9 cumbersome artillery pieces of various calibers and about 1,000 muskets. Urrea, who expected to lay siege to the fort, was unaware of Fannin's departure until 11 a.m. When the Texians crossed the San Antonio River, one of the carts carrying the largest cannon fell into the river and had to be fished out. This wasted valuable time, and 3 Texians, Jack Shackelford, Burr H. Duval, and Ira Westover, protested the stop, arguing that the column should not rest until reaching the protection of the Coleto Creek timber. When Urrea learned of Fannin's departure, he quickly left Goliad without his artillery and the full force of his army in order to narrow down Fannin's 2-hour lead. Mexican sources indicated that he set out with 80 cavalrymen and 360 infantrymen. He discovered through his mounted scouts the location of Fannin's column and that the rebel force was considerably smaller than they had anticipated. This information prompted him to return 100 infantrymen to Goliad to help escort the artillery from Presidio La Bahia and join him as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Albert C. Horton's 30 cavalrymen were serving as advance guards and were positioned to cover all sides of the Texian force. However, the rear guard was not alert and did not detect the Mexican cavalry approaching the Texian position. Shortly after they resumed their march, another Texian cart broke down, and his cargo had to be transferred to another, delaying the retreat even further. Shortly after, Fannin had sent Horton to scout the Coleto Creek timber that was in sight. Then, out of nowhere, the Mexican cavalry overtook Fannin's Texians. As the Texians tried to get to high ground 400 to 500 yards away, the ammunition cart broke down. While all of this was happening, Fannin called a council to determine the feasibility of taking what ammunition they could and reaching the timber. With little water and situated in an open prairie covered with high grass that obscured the vision of their enemy, Fannin's men made ready for a defense. Their hollow square was 3 ranks deep. Each man received 3 to 4 muskets, bayonets, more than 40 pairs of pistols, and an abundant amount of ammunition. The San Antonio Grays and Alabama Red Rovers formed the front line, while Duval's Mustangs and others formed the rear guard. The left flank was defended by Westover's regulars, and the right by the Mobile Grays. The artillery was placed in the corners of their position, and Fannin assumed a command position in the rear of the right flank. In addition, an outpost of sharpshooters was formed around Abel Morgan's hospital wagon. Soon after Urrea's cavalry managed to stop Fannin's retreat, the Mexican general amassed his troops and attacked the square. The Mexican force would attack the Texians from all directions. However, the Texians were able to prevent the Mexicans from breaking the square. Urrea was impressed with the fact that the Texians had managed to maintain the square against 3 charges. After sunset, Urrea ordered Mexican sharpshooters to be positioned in the tall grass around the square. Before Texian sharpshooters were able to remove the threat, the Mexican sharpshooters were able to inflict more casualties. Although the fighting on March 19th had demoralized the Texian soldiers, they were encouraged by the thought that Horton would succeed in getting reinforcements from Victoria. However, Horton had not been able to break through the Mexican defenses. During the day's fighting, the Texian soldiers that were retreating to Victoria after the Battle of Prairie were close enough to Fanian to hear gunfire. However, they were exhausted and hungry and did not move to the square. Urrea stationed 3 detachments of Mexican troops around the square to prevent the Texians from escaping, and during the night, Mexican false bugle calls were sounded to keep the Texians alert. The Texians' lack of water and the inability to light fires in the square meant that the wounded Texians could not be treated. The pain being experienced by the wounded resulted in a general decrease in morale during the night. The lack of water also meant that the artillery could not be used effectively the next day because water was needed to cool and clean the cannons. At 6:15 a.m. on March 20th, the Mexicans regrouped and began another attack. After 1 or 2 rounds of artillery were fired at the Texian position, Fanian and his officers concluded that the Texians could not take another day of fighting and decided to surrender. They drafted terms of surrender, which included statements that the Texians wounded would be treated, that they would gain all the protections expected as prisoners of war, and that they would be paroled to the United States. However, Santa Anna had stated earlier that any Texian can only be allowed to surrender unconditionally. As a result, Urrea could not guarantee that all the terms would be followed by Santa Anna. He stated that he would talk to Santa Anna on behalf of the terms of surrender. The document was signed, and as a result of the signing, the Battle of Coleto ended, with over 10 killed and 65 wounded or missing on the Mexican side, and at least 100 killed and 67 wounded on the Texian side. Those Texians that could walk were sent to Goliad under Mexican escort. It would take until March 23rd until those Texians that could not walk were transported to Goliad. During that time, Mexican physicians were told that wounded Mexicans were a priority to treat as opposed to the wounded Texians. Urrea, meanwhile, had moved on to Victoria, from where he wrote to Santa Anna a letter recommending that the Texian prisoners be treated with clemency. However, Santa Anna did not follow Urrea's recommendation, instead ordering Mexican commander Jose Nicolas de la Portilla at Goliad to execute the Texian prisoners. On Palm Sunday, March 27, 1836, Portilla had between 425 and 445 Texians marched from Fort Defiance in 3 columns on the Bayard Road, San Patricio Road, and Victoria Road, and would begin the most infamous massacre in Texas history, known as the Goliad Massacre.